seeing Putin shaking hands with African leaders saying he supported them, absolutely, he's doing the opposite because he's starving their people. So I call on the UN to do something because that is their job. It is quite obtuse that you hear coming out of Moscow how disgruntled and how ridiculous it is that Ukraine should fire a few drones into Moscow. But at the same time, Russia is firing drones, hundreds of drones every night and day into Ukraine. And the attack on the ports in the Odesa are purely to destroy grain. And we know that the Russians have destroyed a lot of grain. We know that the attacks last night were, on the border with Romania. I mean, they are a tiny misjudgment away from attacking NATO soil. But most significant, I think it is the grain itself. About 40 million tons of grain is usually exported from Ukraine every year. Majority of it goes to the poorer countries in Africa and Asia. And because of the attacks over the last few weeks, the price of grain has absolutely shot up. So that those people who could only just afford grain in the poorest countries in Africa now can't. So they are going to be starved. And, I think this is another war crime. It is absolutely deliberate and cynical. I personally believe it's all very well sort of shouting about it, but I think it's time that the UN got out of its ivory tower and, got down into the Black Sea and started doing something about this, because we need to enable, the free world, need to enable this grain going to Africa and Asia. And once it's 12 miles off the coast of Ukraine, it's in international waters. Now, these ships should then be protected, I believe, by the UN or even by NATO so that they can get where they're going, because it is having a hugely destabilising impact in places like Africa, which require stability and require the basics of having food. Seeing Putin shaking hands with African leaders saying he supported them, well, absolutely, he's doing the opposite because he's starving their people. So this is something I think that we really need to seriously look at it. And I call on the UN to do something because, that is their job. It's already hot air coming out of New York, but what we need is action down in the Black Sea to support these ships getting out of out into the free world and to feed these people who really need it. I accept it's difficult. There are various rules of what ships are allowed into the Black Sea. Basically, you need a Black Sea coast, but there are NATO countries like Romania and Bulgaria and Turkey who could do this. And I'm sure there are other countries, for instance, India, although they don't have Black Sea coasts, but India is sort of sitting in the middle of all of this. It has a massive navy, and if it wants to help, then and grain from Ukraine would go to India as well, then it could do that. So I think these ships need to be protected so that the Russians can't interdict them. I mean, the Russians are claiming that some of these empty grain ships are carrying explosives, but under the grain deal, the Russians inspected every ship going through the Bosporus. So, that is a ridiculous statement. But I think it's no good for the world to sit back and see 40 million tons of grain go up in smoke, because it might not seem a big deal for us sat in the UK or for Russians sat in Moscow. But when you rely on grain as the sole subsistence for your life, and suddenly you can't afford it, then that's a life and death situation. And it's up to those countries that can do it to enable this stuff to go. So, yeah, protect it, no-fly zones over these grain ships, whatever it requires. But I think we need to do something. It seems that the only people who come to his table now are dictators and despots like North Korea and Iran and starving African countries. And the African peace deal that was announced over the last couple of days, almost appears to be written by Putin. It sort of says there'll be, some troop withdrawals, there'll be some peace deal, and Putin charges by the International Criminal Court against Putin will be dropped. I mean, absolutely ridiculous. Of course, any peace deal needs to be looked at because we want to prevent, as many people dying as possible. But this rather cynical use of African leaders by Putin really underwrites the sort of person he is and the sort of regime he's running.